So I'm Randy May, president of the Free State Foundation, as most of you know, and I want to welcome you here. I also want to welcome especially Arizona Public Broadcasting System here. Arizona PBS is here, and we're especially pleased with that. Some of you have heard me say before, C-SPAN has covered quite a few of our events, and they were here to cover our annual conference held on May 31st here at the Press Club. And I said at the beginning that I'm a C-SPAN junkie. Those of you that watch C-SPAN know that we refer to ourselves sometimes as C-SPAN junkies. And I'm always glad when they're here, but I'm especially pleased today that Arizona PBS is here, and I might become an Arizona PBS junkie as well. So if somehow you thought that you might have stumbled into another program on net neutrality, you're wrong, and probably happily so. Indeed, it's possible, although I wouldn't bet my house on it for sure, that we might get pretty far into our discussion today without ever uttering the words net neutrality. But truth be told, the subject we're going to be discussing today is as important as any other communications policy topic. The title of our program is Next Generation 5G Wireless Networks, Seizing the Opportunities and Overcoming the Obstacles. So as not to steal the thunder of any of our distinguished speakers today, I'm only going to say a few brief words by way of introduction so you'll appreciate why I just said the topic we're discussing is so important. According to CTIA, the Wireless Association, 5G networks will be up to 100 times faster and 5 times more responsive than today's networks. They will be able to support 100 times more devices, beacons, and wearables. Now, obviously, perhaps you might get different estimates from different people or entities, but if those figures are even close to being correct, you could see how important and transformative 5G is going to be. Now, furthermore, future deployment of 5G wireless networks is projected to produce an additional $500 billion of economic growth, and wireless operators are expected to invest an estimated $275 billion over the next decade to deploy 5G across America. And that investment is projected to create 3 million new jobs. Again, I'm not here to vouch that every single one of those figures is going to prove correct, but if you just heard what I said, and if you wanted to actually cut those numbers in half or by 2/3, you would still understand and appreciate how important 5G deployment is. So that's the opportunities part of the program's title, but there's also the overcoming the obstacles part. To build out 5G networks nationwide and to realize their full potential, an incredibly large number of new cell towers, base stations, and small cell sites, along with widespread modifications to existing sites, will be necessary to seize the opportunities presented by next generation wireless services and overcome the obstacles. All levels of government, federal, state, and local, have a role to play. Now, I'm not going to say any more because I'm sure our speakers are going to address both the opportunities and the obstacles in a way that by the time we're done today will give us all a very good understanding of the public policy implications of 5G. Now, what I want to do is introduce our speaker and tell you about the program today. Most of you here, hopefully all of you, know that Commissioner Mike O'Reilly has been slated to be really the opening keynote speaker at the program today. But the House Commerce Committee decided that they were going to have a hearing, oversight hearing today And that's going on right now. And, you know, might have been surprising to me, but Commissioner O'Reilly decided that he was going to have to be there rather than up here. Now, one of our speakers today is former FCC Commissioner Jonathan Adelstein, and I know if he were confronted with that choice as to whether to be at the House oversight hearing or to be here when he was a commissioner, he would have been here. You don't have to respond to that at all. But anyway, here's what I'm hoping, and I know Commissioner O'Reilly is too, that if that hearing winds up in time and he can get away, he said he'll dash right up here, and I told him if he gets here by 1:30, then we'll all be ready and waiting. And if he does happen to appear at that door, let's give him a big round of applause, a nice welcome. But in the meantime, we're very fortunate, and I'm grateful that we have with us Don Stockdale, the new wireless Telecommunications Bureau Chief at the FCC, to lead off today. And then we're going to follow that with the panel. After Don's through, I'm going to bring up the panel, and then we'll know then what's occurred with the hearing at that point. So what I want to do first, I'm just going to introduce Don, and we'll do that part of the program, and then we'll do the panel. Donald Stockdale was just recently, I think it was just about a month ago, that Don returned to the FCC to serve as chief of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau under Chairman Pai. Now, a lot of you have been here before, and you've heard me say this, but it's true for this program. In the interest of time, you've got your bio materials right there, so I'm going to give you just the highlights of each one of these people and just briefly. And the thing I would say about Don Stockdale, as you can see, is that he's a PhD economist and a lawyer. He's both of those things. So, on some days, Chairman Pai might say, I need an economist, and there he is. Some days he might say, I need a lawyer. He's both of those. He's both of those things, and he served in increasingly prestigious, responsible positions at the Federal Communications Commission before he took up this latest post. So, Don, I just want to ask you, is this your first speech since you've been named chief of the? Just say it is anyway. But
it is.
Okay. See, this is Don's first speech since assuming that position, and I'm really pleased that he's here today. And he's going to speak, and then we're going to take just a couple questions when Don's finished. Don.
Okay. Thank you, Randy, and thanks to the Free State Foundation for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today about 5G, an incredibly important and potentially transformative technological innovation. Now, I was happy to step in to replace Commissioner Riley when he was delayed. But I hope that you will not hold me to the standards that you will hold Commissioner Riley, because, as Randy pointed out, I've only been in this job 4 weeks, and I'm still learning the ropes. So I hope you'll take that into account. Now, before I begin my talk, I need to start with a standard disclaimer that the remarks I give today reflect my own views and do not necessarily reflect those of the Commission or any commissioner. So, having gotten that out of the way, let's turn to substance. The FCC is dedicated to promoting investment in both fixed and mobile broadband networks, and it is trying to do so through a light-touch regulatory environment that is intended to reduce barriers to investment and to innovation. Now, in addition, Chairman Pai has repeatedly stated that his top priority is closing the digital divide and bringing the benefits of the internet age to all Americans. Now, today, Randy has asked me to focus on 5G. So what I want to do is focus on two broad categories of policy reforms that relate to broadband wireless in general and to 5G in particular. And they are, first, policies to make more spectrum available for flexible use. Second, policies to facilitate infrastructure deployment, both wireline and wireless. And finally, I want to mention briefly the Commission's efforts to extend wireless broadband to areas that are currently unserved. And I want to mention the potential relevance of 5G to achieving that goal. So let's start with policies to increase the supply of spectrum. The Commission's approach to spectrum policy is based on a three-part formula. First, we want to make spectrum available for both licensed and unlicensed uses. Second, we want to encourage and protect innovation driving competition. And third, we want to remove regulatory barriers to deployment and, excuse me, and to stay out of the way of technological development. Now, in making spectrum available, the FCC is focused on enabling flexible use. Instead of mandating that a specific wireless technology be used for a particular spectrum band, we leave that choice to the private sector. And we at the Commission believe that that has been a wise choice. This approach has allowed wireless networks the freedom to evolve. And this approach also means that 5G services could be deployed today in existing flexible use, licensed and unlicensed spectrum bands. Now, the Commission understands that no single spectrum range can meet all the diverse demands of 5G applications. Accordingly, the Commission is working to free up spectrum in all ranges, including low, medium, and high bands. For example, in the case of low-range spectrum bands, which are valued because of their propagation characteristics, that is, they will transmit over long distances, in order to address demands for low-band spectrum, the FCC recently concluded the broadcast incentive auction. This is the first time, I believe, in history that any regulator has conducted a two-sided spectrum auction, and it is an auction that regulators in other countries are following closely. This spectrum ended up yielding 84 megahertz of low-band spectrum in the 600 megahertz band, which will be made available for broadband and other commercial uses. We also recently updated technical rules and power limitations in the 800 megahertz cellular band. This should make that band more amenable to mobile broadband services. Now, with regard to mid-band spectrum, we are continuing to work with industry and with NTIA and other federal agencies to finalize spectrum rules in the 3.5 gigahertz band. And as many of you may know, staff recently circulated a notice of inquiry that will soon seek comment on flexible use opportunities for bands in the 3.7 to 24 gigahertz range. And in particular, the NOI will seek comment on three specific bands, the 3.7 to 4.2, 5.925 to 6.425, and 6.425 to 7.125 bands. Finally, in the ongoing Spectrum Frontiers proceeding, we continue to establish operational and licensing rules for millimeter wave spectrum above 24 gigahertz. This spectrum will provide a strong foundation for advancing 5G networks and the Internet of Things. Now, in the Spectrum Frontiers proceeding, the FCC has already made 11 gigahertz of high-frequency spectrum available, 4 gigahertz in the licensed bands, and 7 gigahertz for unlicensed use. And we're in the process of examining an additional 18 gigahertz for possible use. Okay, now let's turn and talk a little bit about potential obstacles to infrastructure deployment. The second policy reform that is critical to promoting 5G is to facilitate both wireline and wireless broadband infrastructure. Now, to give you a sense of how important it is, today there are about 300,000 cell towers in the United States. But the mobile wireless industry has already been densifying its 4G networks in order to bolster capacity by deploying multiple small cells. But the technological or technical characteristics of millimeter wave spectrum, which is expected to play a very big role in 5G, will make small cell deployment even more critical. In fact, I've been told 5G build-out will require the deployment of literally millions of small cells, which differ significantly from conventional cell towers. Now, and one thing I should point out here is that for each of these small cell deployments, there needs to be backhaul. So this also requires the deployment of both fixed wireless and fiber infrastructure so that these towers can be connected to the wireless networks. Now, last summer, the Wireless Bureau took an initial step towards facilitating infrastructure deployment by signing an agreement with Advisory Council on Historic Preservation to streamline small cell deployments. And this spring, both the wireless and wireline bureaus initiated rulemaking proceedings to review numerous aspects of infrastructure deployment regulation. These NPRMs, among other things, will explore ways to expedite local review and speed up access to rights-of-way, examine the reasonableness of fees and of our pole attachment rules, and seek comment on how to expedite historic preservation and environmental reviews. In addition, Chairman Pai has formed the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, or BDAC. BDAC is made up of representatives of major stakeholder groups, and it is now in the midst of comprehensively examining deployment issues. And we expect that it will propose model codes for states and municipalities and propose ways for improving wireless infrastructure's siting procedures for federal lands. Finally, let me just say a couple of words about universal service support for high-cost areas. In the United States, as you all know, there are many rural, high-cost areas where it is simply uneconomic to deploy wireline and wireless broadband. As a result, the Commission has adopted universal service policies to provide support in these high-cost rural areas. Now, as part of its broader universal service program, the Commission created a mobility fund, and it is currently designing a reverse auction that will provide up to $4.53 billion in recurring support over the next 10 years. I should note that the U.S. was also an innovator in introducing reverse auctions for providing universal service support. The Commission is also developing a reverse auction to distribute universal service support for wireline infrastructure. And while this is my own personal opinion, given the promise of 5G, I think that we will find that 5G will serve an important role in helping deploy broadband to rural areas. So, to recap, the Commission is committed to promoting deep deployment of 5G by first making more low, medium, and high bands spectrum available for flexible use. Second, by adopting policies to encourage infrastructure deployment and helping to reduce or eliminate obstacles to such deployment. And third, developing efficient universal service policies to support the deployment of broadband networks in high-cost rural areas. By unleashing the potential for 5G, we can accelerate the growth of our economy, create new jobs and new opportunities, and improve the quality of life for all Americans. Thank you.
Don, thank you very much. You know, I just asked Don on Friday, I think it was, to come over and speak, and that was terrific on short notice. And when I have you back, I promise I'll even give you more notice. But although I now know you don't need much notice. So look, a couple things. You know, you let me forget. I did forget to remind you to tweet, and our handle is, and it should be somewhere on that piece of paper, but it's hashtag FSF5G, FSF5G. So please tweet away, and I want you to keep eating. You know, I wanted to start the program, as I said, so we would make sure we got into it. But you know, I also paid for this food, and if my mother were here and she looked around and saw these plates, she would say, you know, you need to finish more of this lunch. So keep eating, please. So what we're going to do now is take a couple questions. I just, you know, promised Don we just have a couple. So I'm going to recognize people and wait for the mic. I think we have a mic. So first time we're going to call on Paul Kirby. Paul, the mic is heading in your direction here, and just identify yourself.
Paul Kirby with TR Daily. You mentioned the 3.5 gigahertz band. I think you did. So one of the issues there have been some
3.5?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
The 3.5, a number of the SAS administrators have been conditionally approved. Nothing as far as the ESC, the environmental sensing capability. My understanding is there's issues with NTIA and federal agencies in terms of coming up with an agreement for how that would work. Can you give us any update on the ESC?
I'm not sure what I can say that's public. I will say that the FCC is continuing to work with NTIA and with the federal agencies to try to complete the construction of the SASs and the deployment of the ESCs. And it's my understanding that progress is continuing to be made.
Howard over there, Howard Busker.
Hey, Howard Busker, Communications Daily. I'm trying to figure out something I can ask you that you might be able to answer today, because I know you're pretty new over there. But yeah, one of the big things that's been said out there has been, you know, the FCC plans all these auctions for the high frequency spectrum, but we haven't gotten much feedback from the FCC in terms of what you all are thinking in terms of timing, or, you know, because you know, that's I mean, everybody's talking about 5G and how important the high frequency spectrum is. So just, do you have anything on that you can tell us?
Well, it is one of the issues that we are currently working on. We are in the midst right now of trying to develop the auction software and the application software for the two reverse auctions, and we're sort of devoting 100% of our resources to that. And we're then trying to sort of develop a sort of tentative list or ordering of subsequent auctions based on when we think the spectrum can be made available. I think that's all I can say at this point.
Okay, well, if there is one more question, I'll take that. And if not, just join with me in thanking Don again for coming over, please. Okay, I'm going to ask our panel now to come up and take their seats here, please. So while they're coming up and taking their seats, you know, there's so many different dimensions to this issue. And already today we've heard auctions mentioned so many times. I'll just say that because I don't know whether it'll come up. I don't know whether it'll come up in today's discussion. It might, but just in the past week, you know, one of the things that's important to 5G is clearing the spectrum from the most recent auction. That's going to be important, and I know one of the issues is paying for the relocation, whether there's enough money for that. And I know that the commissioners, at least I saw that Chairman Pai and Commissioner O'Reilly said that they would urge Congress to kick in to support the relocation with additional money. I know that T-Mobile has just in the past week or 10 days said that they would make some voluntary payments to relocate stations to help clear spectrum, including, I think, public broadcast stations, I believe. So those types of things are important for 5G and maybe really perhaps different than some of the other things we're going to talk about today. So with that, what I want to do now is introduce the panel, again, under the same rule that I've already laid down about brevity, and I'm going to introduce them in the order that I'd like for them to speak, that I'm going to call on them to speak. So first, that would be Robert Fisher from Verizon Communications. Robert is Verizon's Senior Vice President of Federal Government Relations. So he's responsible for overseeing Verizon's federal, state, and local tax policy advocacy, in addition to all of the other federal aspects. And he told me actually while we were having lunch that tax policy, believe it or not, well, you probably would believe it. It's very important that that's one of their key issues now. But today it's going to be, we're going to zero in on 5G. So we're glad that Robert is here. Next, I'm going to ask Jonathan Adelstein to speak. As I've already said, Jonathan is a former FCC commissioner. He served at the commission from 2002 to 2009. After his service at the FCC, Jonathan then served as administrator of the Department of Agriculture's Rural Utilities Service, so he certainly has the perspective of the rural areas, which I'm sure we'll figure in our discussion today. And prior to that, he had held a number of high-level positions in the Senate. Next, I'm going to ask Jeff Weninger to speak. This is the first time I've had a chance to meet Jeff. He's traveled all the way from Arizona. I wasn't sure even how to pronounce his name, but he just said it rhymes with vinegar. So I think I've said that right, Jeff Weninger. Jeff is chairman of the House Commerce Committee, not the one that scheduled that hearing today that has Commissioner O'Reilly tied up, but the Arizona Legislature's House Commerce Committee. He's a member also of the House Banking and Insurance Committee and the Ways and Means Committees in the Arizona Legislature, and also a small business owner. And as he'll describe, he's played a major role, maybe the major role in some Arizona legislation that was passed that's relevant. And then last but not least is Crystal. Tully. Crystal is the majority counsel at the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, where she's a top advisor to Senator John Thune and a more pertinent as well to our program today, a top advisor on 5G and other mobile issues, and I expect things like the Mobile Now bill, which he may talk about. So we're really pleased to have all of you here. I've told them that they are going to speak no more than 6 minutes initially, so we can have an inter-exchange and also have time for more questions. Those of you in the audience know that I'll actually enforce that, you know, unlike some people. They don't all know that, but I am, so you limit your remarks to 6 minutes, and we're going to start off with Robert Fisher.
All right,
Robert.
thank you. This works okay. Thanks, Randy. So as they used to say in the Senate, I will keep my remarks brevity very brief, and then I will yield back the floor. So thanks for being here. It's fun to be here with Jonathan and Crystal and with Jeff. Jonathan and I were actually staffers together back in the Senate, more years back than we probably care to admit. I've known Crystal for a long time, and Jeff hails from my home state of Arizona. So it's good to be up here with a panel of great folks. So I appreciate everybody being here to talk a little bit about 5G. This is an extremely important topic for Verizon, and we have spent a lot of time and are spending a lot of time, you know, plowing the road ahead for 5G. And you know, I think the remarks that I'm probably going to really talk about most here, and then we can have some questions, is really kind of, you know, focusing on the expediency that I think we all need to really focus on how we do this and how quickly we do it. And I kind of hearken back to, you know, the debate of years ago when we were working on 3G policy and really concerned about the U.S. being, you know, overtaken by those in Europe and Asia who were deploying 3G much faster. And I think we made up a lot of ground in the 4G world by the U.S. leading the way and paving the way, and that was done not only through industry efforts, I think, but, you know, efforts at the FCC as well to make sure that we led with our first foot forward on that. And I think it's just as equally important that we keep our eye on the ball for 5G, and that we continue to work hard to find not only the policies that need to be done in Congress, but also within the FCC and the federal government to try to find ways to get 5G moving fast so that the U.S. does maintain its leadership position. You know, at least for Verizon, you know, we, you know, and I'm sure some of my industry colleagues would debate it, but we led the way in 4G deployment, and we're doing the same thing on 5G. We already have 11 test markets already up and running in the field today in a variety of different places across the U.S., testing all kinds of different types of topography and, you know, city attributes to figure out exactly how each, you know, market is different from one another and what is needed to make, you know, 5G successful. So we've already got those, and those, by the way, are consumer trials. They're not even just field trials. Those are actual consumer trials where we're going out and doing, you know, fixed 5G. So we're really excited about that. Those are ongoing now. We actually have one here in Washington, D.C. So, you know, we're kind of leading with our best foot forward and trying to put our money where our mouth is and showing that we can do this. And I think that we've shown that 5G has some great promises, and it has a lot of great promises for the entire country. And I think that, you know, a lot of the credit should go, you know, thus far to the FCC and some of the work that they're plowing through. And I know that Chairman Pai and his team are working very hard on policies that will help facilitate 5G. And I also know that even within the new administration, you know, they're getting up to speed on a lot of these issues, but they're also working hard to try to figure out what they can do. And there was already at least one roundtable, I think, as many folks saw, that a lot of, you know, different industries participated in the roundtable with OSTP and the president. And I think a lot of that showed that there was a sense of urgency and what it can do for the country. And I think maybe, as you know, Jeff will talk to you a little bit about what they've done in Arizona. But I think there's a way to make this happen where you can bring together private industries along with public partners and all the governments to make it work. And I think a great model is my home state of Arizona. I'm going to brag about my home state a little bit. We also have the best Mexican food. and I'll give you some names of those places if you want later. But and great sandwich shops too, right, Jeff? So, but there's a way to do that, and I think in Arizona they proved that model, and that model was to bring together all the stakeholders, both local and all the carriers together to try to figure out what's the best policy so that we can get streamlined access to rights of way and deploy infrastructure in a quick manner. And Jeff will really talk more to that because he was intimately involved in that and getting that legislation passed. But I think there's a way to replicate that in a federal model where we bring together all the stakeholders through the FCC, the administration, Congress, and Chairman Thune is leading with his Mobile Now legislation, which I know he's trying to get done, and the industry has been really behind that effort as well. So I think there's a way in some to bring all these parties together to try and find a way that's not adversarial, but in fact where both industry and the cities and the citizens can see the benefits of 5G, which will bring improved health care. We talk about driverless cars. One of the points I always like to make is, driverless cars don't work without robust wireless networks. And the latency that you have on 5G versus a latency on 4G, super important, right? A car, if it sees a pedestrian, it's an autonomous vehicle, it's got to stop. You can't have a lot of latency. So these things and all these great wonders that we're talking about only happen if we have robust 5G networks. So, Randy, I'm thankful to be here again today, and as I said, I yield the floor.
Thank you, Robert. We're glad you're here. I mentioned when I was doing the introductions that Jeff was a small business owner. He actually, I didn't say that he actually owns 2 restaurants. That's his business, at least as I understand it. So if you were going to mention any names, you make sure you get the names of Jeff's restaurants when you. Oh, okay. So I think with that, we're going to turn to Jonathan, please.
Well, thanks, Randy. You'd asked me at the beginning if I'd rather be here in my days on the FCC or at the House Oversight hearing, and I'd say I'd rather be here. But that's not high praise because, frankly, I'd rather be anywhere than at a House Oversight hearing. But what is high praise is that you put together an excellent panel, an excellent program here today with fabulous speakers, Don and Commissioner hopefully will make it. And I think you asked about what the biggest obstacles are and what the biggest solutions are, and you really laid it out in your introduction when you talked about, I think both obstacle and solution are in the same thing. A little hidden in plain sight is you said it's going to be $275 billion in infrastructure investment to build out 5G. Yes, it's an opportunity for jobs, for all that the broadband enables, for economic growth, but it's also a huge obstacle. I mean, the issue is how do carriers come up with and justify that level of investment in capital, which is clearly the biggest solution to the 5G issue. Will the revenue follow is a great topic to look at. And, we see some warning signs in today. Robert can't say it, but I will. I mean, we see some warning signs. If you read the Wall Street Journal, you look at the financial news, you see that cell phone prices have fallen 13% this year. That has driven down the entire CPI for the United States. And at the same time that that's happening, consumers are increasing their cell phone data consumption massively. As a matter of fact, at the same time that's happening, carriers are offering unlimited data plans. So this is great news for consumers. And they've been getting more for less for a long time out of the wireless industry. But the issue is, what does it mean for consumers in the long term? How do they get their needs met? Can investment in wireless networks keep up with their insatiable growth in demand at the same time that they expect to get more for less? That's far less certain. I think transitioning the next generation of networks has always been expensive, from 3G to 4G, from 4G to 4G LTE-A, and of course to 5G, as we've discussed. Takes not only money, but a lot of time. And the industry is still building out 4G. We're still intensively densifying networks to keep up with 4G demand, also pursuing 5G, as you laid out, Robert, and building that network to prepare for 5G. And the only way that cities and towns are going to keep up is through more infrastructure. And the only way they get more infrastructure is through responsible regulations. Given the shrinking margins and declining average revenue per user that we're seeing, there really isn't enough room in the system to allow for massive costs that government imposes or delays, which are equivalent to money. I think creating a predictable business environment helps wireless infrastructure companies to invest in these networks. It's tough for companies to make such massive investments without all levels of government working efficiently together to encourage infrastructure investment. And the good news is that we are seeing that now, I think, more than we ever have. A good example is how WI worked with Congress on a law that requires co-location by right so that our members could rapidly upgrade and add new equipment to existing infrastructure. We saw 4G build out very quick as a result. And then we got the FCC to put forth the strongest possible rules to support that law. And WI also led the way in creating shot clocks and speeding the applications processing for wireless infrastructure. And I think Don made clear that now, again, we're seeing the FCC make an incredible priority of this. We've seen so many excellent proceedings that are underway now that Don discussed. I don't think we've ever seen better leadership at the FCC than we have under Chairman Pai, under Commissioner O'Reilly, who we're going to hear from, who's made this a major issue, Commissioner Clyburn, and of course, Don Stockdale. Now we're working with state legislatures as well, making huge progress across the country on bills to streamline infrastructure siting on a statewide level, focusing on rights of way. 11 states have passed laws in the last year to remove regulatory barriers, including, of course, Arizona, due to the excellent leadership of Jeff Weninger. And we're really seeing a lot of progress in other states, and we're getting ready for another push in the next round of sessions. Of course, Chairman Thune and Congress are involved in efforts at the same time to promote siting of wireless infrastructure, particularly focused on federal lands where they have a lot of jurisdiction. And I'm also chairing a group on the BEAD Act that Don mentioned on federal lands, so hopefully we'll make progress on that after many years of frustration. Let me just wrap up with an interesting piece of research by Dr. Rick Thacker, who's actually here today. He was a consultant for WIA, and he did a work for the NSF that found that while today's wireless carriers have enough spectrum to meet their needs, his study showed there's a real need for more spectrum going forward because of growing data demand. In fact, his research found that by 2019, there may be a spectrum deficit of 195 megahertz if no new spectrum is released and small cell deployment stays at the current rate. So we can't let that happen. But good news is his research also quantified alternatives to keeping up with demand for more capacity. A 5% increase, he found, in the amount of annual cell site growth over the next 5 years could lower the need for more spectrum by another 98 megahertz. So you see that infrastructure and spectrum are sometimes fungible. You can increase densification, you can reuse spectrum, and that's what the industry is doing today, given the limitations on spectrum. So as Don laid out so eloquently, we need more spectrum, we need more infrastructure. And my conclusion to the question here is that the key to solution to making 5G a reality, I think, is more infrastructure. But the biggest obstacle is finding the capital and the regulatory regime to get that infrastructure deployed efficiently. And they go hand in hand. And the regulatory regime, getting it right, will stretch limited capital budgets to help them meet consumer demand. And we really don't have any room to spare in getting that equation right.
Jonathan, thank you very much. You know, you may not recall this, but I'm pretty sure when you were serving as a commissioner that I invited you to speak at a Free State Foundation event or two, and I never snagged you for whatever reason. But you see, I didn't give up. I'm glad you're here, and that was terrific. And we're going to get you back again. So thank you. Okay, now everybody remember the Twitter handle. That's really important. FSFFG. So now we're going to turn to Jeff to talk about especially the Arizona experience and what was accomplished there and how it was done. Jeff.
Randy, thank you. Thank you to Free State Foundation for inviting me here. Just want to introduce my son real quick. He's back there filming me. He got to take off from his first 2 days of school in Arizona to come here, kind of get an education. So I do have a unique experience because I'm kind of heading up this particular bill, I think, is that I am a small business owner, so I understand, especially in restaurants, overburdening regulations. I'm also a former city council member for 8 years before I was in the legislature. So I understand that need for local control that the cities have, and now I'm a state legislator. So when we started this negotiation, we started off very far apart. There was multiple stakeholders from League of Cities, the utilities, co-ops, the counties, and we had upwards of 40 or 50 people in each stakeholder meeting, and we probably had 20 altogether. So it was a very interesting process. At first couple meetings was everybody just yelling and screaming and getting their frustrations out, and then we kind of started just zeroing in on what each side wanted. And we were incredibly far apart in the beginning. But it was an interesting political climate on this exact issue, because at the same time you have, the bureaucracy of cities mainly is what I'm going to focus on. The counties were much more amicable. But with the cities is you're hanging on that traditional local control. But at the same time, I can tell you as a former city council member, you don't want to have to vote on every single cell phone sighting that comes before you, because then you have 20 or 30 people in front of you, and a lot of times they're not happy. They're not happy as they have a cell phone on their hip as they're speaking, but they're still not happy. So taking that off of their plate is attractive to councils. Plus, they know that they're going to be one of the first people that starts being blamed as soon as their data and they're not getting a robust cell signal. So I look at this a little bit to what a couple of the other speakers were saying as critical infrastructure. Steve Forbes wrote an article talking about the highway system, comparing this to the highway system in the 50s. And the major difference I think they're both incredibly important, and this is just as important as that was, but the difference I see is that private sector's paying for this. It wasn't done with public money like the highway system. And I think just a cleaner regulatory environment encourages that even more. So I just want to kind of go through exactly the differences. Randy kind of wanted me to talk about that we had between the cities and the state. So the cities, they had multiple things that were important to them, but these are really, when you drill down, are the very important thing. They wanted to maintain the right-of-way in every instance and basically make it a zoning process. That didn't happen, but the bill does allow them to maintain police power for the right-of-way for public welfare, public safety, and aesthetics. And that was important. So now, as in the interim, they're drafting rules that have to follow certain criteria. It has to fit into those things to where they can, make you conceal. In Paradise Valley, they're very concerned about concealment and aesthetics. So they can make rules that apply to that. They definitely wanted to be indemnified and have insurance provisions for anything that happened in the right-of-way. And the wireless companies wanted to give in on that, so they did that. There's existing master leases that have been negotiated with the wireless companies that they wanted to make sure could stay in place, and that this bill didn't completely take those out. That happened. They are staying in place, but most of these master leases have an out that the wireless company can do anyway. So they can go ahead and withdraw if they want in most instances. And in most instances, I think it's going to make sense, because I would think as a business owner that you would front load the places. Are you going to front load one that's $4,000 a cell site, or the ones that has the new fees that we have that's $50 a site? So not allowing, another thing they didn't want is they didn't want basically the wireless companies getting approved for a site and then waiting 2 or 3 years to build it. So they wanted a shot clock on the wireless companies to go ahead and do it. It has to be within 180 days of the permit expires. Now, the wireless industry really needed 3 things. Again, there was like 50 items, but these were the main things that they had to have and that we ended up getting. Access to the right-of-way. So that used to take a master lease agreement in Arizona. One carrier, it took 3 years to get 9 master lease agreements in place. So if you think about that, I just don't think we're ever, 5G is going to, countries, South Korea, Japan, China, are going to pass us by in a huge way if it takes, every state has hundreds and hundreds of cities and towns, and if you have to go through a maze of regulations in every single city that has different fees, different regulations, different zoning processes, it's just never going to get done in an expedient manner. So they got that in place. Access to the right-of-way is granted under this bill through the permitting process. Poles can be 40 to 50 feet or 10 feet higher than any pole within 500 feet. The next really important thing was cost, obviously. Now, in Arizona, it was dramatically different. There's cities where it costs thousands and thousands, up to $30,000, or $3,000 or $4,000. This creates a level playing field as it relates to cost of small cell deployment, competitively neutral and non-discriminatory fees and rates. So cities can, basically, it put in a cap. They can make it under if they wanted, but right-of-way access is $50 per year per small cell site. Co-location fee on a utility pole is $50 a year. And application fee is capped at $100 for the first 5 in a batch, because these are submitted in batches to make it a little bit more efficient, and $50 for each after the first 5. If you need a whole new utility pole, it's $750. And monopoles are allowed, but that has to be through zoning. Cities wanted full discretion on fees, basically keep charging $3,000, $4,000, $50,000, and luckily that didn't happen. One city said that existing staff time right now is 10 to 30 hours per site, which was $1,200 to $3,600 per site. Now, there's over 80 small cells deployed in this city, and in every instance, the city charged inspection fees, and in all sites, over 80 sites, they made them replace the pole anyway in every single one. So it seems like the standard was, you're just gonna put in a new pole, but yet they went through that whole process, even though they made them put in that pole at the end anyway. So, and then lastly was just streamlining the process. In some cities, you know, this process took a very, very long time. This streamlined it, the bill. So the application to put in new utility pole now must be approved unless it doesn't meet the local codes. But the main thing on this is that it is allowed batching. You could submit up to 25 small cell sites at one time. And then the municipality has to respond within 20 days if your application is complete. And then it goes to 75 days total in order to approve or deny. But they need to take out, if they don't like 1 or 2 of those, it's batched, and they take those 2 out so the other 23 can keep moving along. And I think that's going to create a robust climate in Arizona. You know, I was trying to sell it as, we think if we pass this, we're going to be front-loaded to get this technology there. I'm thinking and hoping that's still going to be the case, and I'm excited to be here, and thank you for having me.
Jeff, thank you very much. Okay, remember when I said when we started that if Commissioner O'Reilly did arrive, where'd he go? Oh, we were gonna, you know, we were gonna give him a big round of applause. Maybe we'll still find a way to do that. I was gonna do it now, but he is here. Jeff, that was really terrific. And while you were talking about that, it really. I told everyone when you arrived we were going to give you a big round of applause, and we knew you would be here. So why don't you make make us all feel better? Why don't you take a seat, because it's going to be, and there's some food. No one's touched this food right here. No one's touched it, but in any event, if you don't want that space with the untouched food, please just have a seat. Aaron, you guys have a seat. Make yourself comfortable. Hey, Mike, you know, to be honest with you, you know, as I am, former Commissioner Adelstein sitting right up here, he said earlier, really, and a bunch of witnesses, you know, are here. He said if he were given a choice between being at a oversight hearing before, the House, or being here, that he would opt to be here anyway. So, that's what, no, he didn't really say that. So we're glad you're here. We're just going to continue on, and then with your permission, and then we'll get to you. But Jeff, what I really wanted to say to you was, in order to get that accomplished in Arizona, it made me think that now that you've done that, we could really use you up here in Washington, with that type of negotiation skill that you must have brought to that. And the other thing I want to say, really, I was thinking while you were talking, we've got you from Arizona, and then Robert mentioned that Arizona is his home state. And we're really pleased that Arizona PBS is here with us. So, I just want to say that I'm sure we're all pleased that Senator McCain really is able to get on a plane and to fly back to Washington, regardless of how you feel about any vote he may take. I know that we all hope that he continues to do well, and I know our prayers are with him, Senator McCain. Okay, so now we're going to hear last from Crystal, and then we'll have a few questions and answers as well before Commissioner Riley speaks. Crystal.
So thank you, Randy, and to the Free State Foundation for holding this very timely seminar today. And I know I'm standing in the way of Commissioner O'Reilly's remarks, so I will be brief. So as we all know, the advancement of high-speed broadband has been the driving force behind much of the economic growth we've seen over the last several years. The demand for faster speeds, higher data capacity, and ubiquitous mobile coverage will continue to grow. So the billions of dollars investment that we've all talked about today, which is in fact largely private funding to build, maintain, and upgrade broadband infrastructure, is evidence that Americans want to be at the cutting edge of technological advancements. So this is why the prospect of a 5G world is exciting, but we must move quickly to free up more spectrum and to ease barriers to deployment if we want to keep up with other areas of the world, including Europe, China, and South Korea, who are all working to allocate more spectrum and quickly deploy infrastructure to meet the rising demand for mobile broadband. So since we can't create more spectrum, assessing the way we use this, what we have, is key to ensuring mobile broadband service continues to improve. To this end, the Senate's looking at ways to better utilize spectrum as we move into a 5G world. And as Randy predicted, I will talk about the Mobile Now Act that takes a step in the right direction by ensuring large swaths of spectrum are available for commercial and unlicensed use by 2020. However, as my boss, Chairman Thune, continues to stress, Mobile Now is merely a down payment, and the committee will continue to look for other ways to utilize spectrum. So spectrum in the mid-band and millimeter wave frequencies hold a ton of potential for commercial and unlicensed use. We're encouraged to see the FCC's intent to open an NOI exploring possible mid-band spectrum allocations, as Don discussed previously. So although spectrum is perhaps the most important component of deploying next-generation mobile broadband services, barriers to infrastructure and investment and deployment continue to cause unnecessary delays. In Congress, we continue to hear from stakeholders, and the message is pretty clear that reducing barriers to entry for new technologies like small cells will help the U.S. become a leader in 5G deployment. In May, we heard from an excellent panel of industry experts and stakeholders, including my fellow panelist, Jeff Weninger, about the need to bring uniformity to the deployment process. Streamlining federal siting processes is a great start. In fact, the government is the largest landowner in the country, holding more than 25% of the nation's land. Improving access to federal property is one way Congress can help reduce barriers to deployment. Mobile Now actually addresses siting on federal lands and includes dig once provisions. We hope to see Senate passage of that bill soon, but in the meantime, we'll continue to look at other avenues to cut through some of the red tape. We've reached out to stakeholders for input on what a broader infrastructure package might look like and to see if there's room for coordination with House and the administration. The House released a discussion draft in March, followed up by a hearing focused on broadband infrastructure siting, and my understanding is the House is still continuing to take meetings with stakeholders to fine-tune that draft bill. Additionally, President Trump has signaled his interest in including broadband as part of an infrastructure package. We think that's a great goal. We're also pleased to see the FCC looking into how state, local, and FCC rules and processes may impair the speed and increase the cost of infrastructure deployment. So as we examine how the law might be updated, we must encourage businesses to work with local policymakers, and Arizona is a great example of that, and recognize the existing relationships that have developed within these communities. It's critically important to safeguard the role our local communities have in permitting and overseeing deployment of physical infrastructure. The good news is, as we move closer to 5G, these networks will not need to rely on macro towers as often, with small cell sites that utilize smaller equipment and can be attached to existing infrastructure. However, one of the primary concerns that we continue to hear in Congress raised by local authorities with regard to small cell siting, particularly in densely populated areas, is the number of sites that will need to be approved. Ensuring that we can afford local authorities the flexibility to decide what's best for their communities is something we're looking closely at as we think about crafting a bill. Lastly, while many of these proposals to streamline infrastructure siting come at little or no cost to the taxpayer, we're also looking at how federal dollars might be used. In the Commerce Committee, we're looking specifically at ways to reduce barriers without creating a new program, but if Congress does go down that road, we'd like and commit funding. Housing the program of an experienced agency like the FCC and a program in existence like the USF is likely the most practical approach. So we hope to have a discussion draft sometime before the end of the summer. So any and all input is much appreciated. So with that, I'm eager to participate in our discussion today. And again, thank you so much for inviting me.
Crystal, thank you for being here. We appreciate those remarks. Okay, let's do a few questions and interactions and so forth, and then we'll hear from Commissioner O'Reilly. But speaking of Commissioner O'Reilly, I'm going to ask Jonathan this question, but I want to quote from something Commissioner O'Reilly said recently, at least as reported in the press, I will say, before the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee. And I think you were talking about some of the obstacles in this state and localities, and at least as it came through to me, you may even have expressed some frustration with some of those obstacles. You said, let's not sugarcoat it, and then in referring to the potential for collaborative discussions and so so forth, Commissioner O'Reilly said, quote, "These hug and kisses approaches have been tried." Yeah, that was interesting to me. These hugs and kisses approaches have been tried. Now, we've heard from Jeff what was accomplished in Arizona through that process there, and that to me looks like a really good bill and a great model. And I know, as Jonathan said, in other states, we're seeing a lot of progress. But I want to ask Commissioner Adelstein this question, because you've served on the commission. One of the issues that the FCC has raised in its notices in the infrastructure proceedings relates to its preemption authority, and it's asking about the extent of it and whether it should exercise its preemption authority. So if we get to a point, or the FCC commissioners do, where the hugs and kisses approaches are not working, talk about whether you believe the commission should actually preempt state or local ordinances, and under what circumstances.
Well, sure. Our members will hug and kiss municipal authorities if that's what it takes to get a tower or a small cell put up. We do it all the time, and it sometimes works, it sometimes doesn't. I think, as you pointed out, some communities are, I think, helpful and some aren't. I mean, the state of Arizona, we just heard today from somebody who was on a city council, now a state chairman of a body that has helped, that cares about it, that wants to get it done. So there are really a lot of good-hearted municipal, local, state authorities that recognize the need for broadband in their communities. I think what Commissioner O'Reilly's talking about, I don't want to characterize it for you, but it's those that are sort of what he described in that event as the sort of bad actors, ones that are dragging their heels. Let's bring everybody up to the standard of the good ones. you know, like Chairman Weninger, that are trying to do the best they can to help get broadband in their community. And I think the FCC in this proceeding has teed up all of these issues really very effectively. The FCC has broad authority under sections 253 and 332 of the Communications Act to preempt local regulations that prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting the deployment of personal wireless services or telecommunications services. So what do we do about it? I mean, unfortunately, the courts have construed Section 253 very narrowly and blunting its effect. So WIA has asked the FCC to interpret and clarify that 253 isn't limited to outright prohibitions on service. The Commission can reconcile, I think, some of these inconsistent interpretations and enforcement of Section 253A by declaring that 253 is violated by any state or local requirement that doesn't treat competitors or different technologies equitably or with competitive neutrality. We often find that wireless is sort of a second-class citizen. You get fiber up and nobody raises a concern, but the second you put an antenna up there, all hell breaks loose. And that's not what the Communications Act says. And you can understand maybe the reasons why. A lot of times it's spurious concerns about RF. Sometimes it's aesthetic concerns, but we don't think that local governments under the Communications Act should be given total discretion over applications and requirements that impose lengthy or onerous application processes that have the effect of prohibiting telecommunications services. So there's a balance here. I mean, we're looking at, yes, they have a big role. Yes, we work in partnership with localities, but at some point, you have to say that the more extreme measures are really the equivalent of prohibiting personal wireless or telecommunication services, and that the FCC was given authority by Congress precisely because Congress wanted these networks built. And that's something I think that the FCC is in a great position now to clarify, given some of the court interpretations we've seen.
Good, thanks. So I'm just going to ask two more questions, and then Commissioner O'Reilly's going to come up, and we'll go from there, and maybe have some questions afterwards for the panel as well, if depending on time. But you see these Free State Foundation hats that are in front of each panelist. I want you to take those with you, but in the meantime, just like Jonathan did, no, Jonathan, put your cap back and put it out so that it's visible to the cameras and everyone else. That's a nice way to put it. And then you can take it with you. Now, Robert, you mentioned, I think, or someone did, that Verizon has been conducting tests on 5G. And during my introduction, you know, I said that I have read that 5G may enable speeds up to 100 times faster. I know sometimes in other places I see 10 times faster, but I've also seen 100 times faster. But just tell us basically, briefly, based on the test, if you've done the testing, what you've learned so far about the 5G.
Well, you know, we've done some testing up at our headquarters in Basking Ridge and a few other places in conjunction with some of our partners, too, on the equipment side. But, you know, one thing that's interesting to see is we did, during the Indy 500, we had essentially a vehicle that was equipped with 5G, and we had some 5G small cells set around the racetrack. And we sent the driver around, and they drove around and just testing the speeds of what they were getting. And they were getting, you know, somewhere up north of, 3 gigabits. And then cool thing that we did was then the driver, essentially, we blacked out the windows of the car so he couldn't see out, and put on a pair of goggles, which then had cameras that were linked up via 5G, and he drove the car around the track blind with just the goggles. So that shows you kind of the speed and the latency. And again, the throughput speeds were absolutely amazing. So, you know, being able to see these things in real life really is, it makes a huge difference in being able to see then what are the applications that can be applied to this service afterwards, right? And that's what we're doing, you know, we hope to do in places like Arizona, which is really talking about smart communities and what does it do for the community itself, right? And we talk about, Wi-Fi hotspots and things like that, but we're also talking about traffic management, right? Making cities and communities a lot smarter with how they can manage traffic flow, but how they can provide city services. And there's going to be so many different applications for 5G, so I think it's really exciting to see, or how it impacts, healthcare and education, and the different things that can be done with 5G. So, we're really excited about it. Jonathan mentioned, I just want to take a second, he was kind of mentioning some of the action here from a state versus a federal perspective. And again, I'd kind of say that, there's two comments I'd make. One, I think there's obviously a kind of a model here for how we can work as an industry and with all the municipalities on how you move forward on 5G. And clearly, we have a state like Arizona. There's been others in Indiana and Iowa and 11 other states that Jonathan was mentioning earlier, where there are partnerships to get that legislation to move forward to make sure we're on the leading edge. But not every state is probably going to be as proactive, right? And so that's why I think, to Crystal's point in the work that is happening, not only at the FCC, but also on the Hill, both in the House and the Senate, is finding legislation, because we have a clear national imperative here, just as we do we talk about, physical infrastructure, and we're talking about infrastructure package now, where we're going to be talking, north of $1 trillion in spending. But there's also a digital layer of infrastructure, which I think is just as equally, if not more important, for how all these things will work down line. And that is, that the U.S. really has, and I'd argue that both the FCC, the administration, and the Congress have a real imperative to make sure to set a national policy for how we do this. After all, we're talking about the internet, and we have an inherent, interstate commerce service that really needs to be applied at a national level. So I think there are multiple answers to this puzzle, and I think we can work with states who want to work with us, and then I think we can work with the federal government to set kind of a national framework policy. And I'm really happy to see all the work that's happening in both the administration, the FCC, and the Hill on that side. So.
Okay, well, I think what I want to do now, is ask Commissioner O'Reilly to come up now, because we really do appreciate the way he's adjusted his schedule. And I'm going to ask the panel to stay up here. You were committed to stay here at least through 2 o'clock, right, under the terms of our agreement. And then after Commissioner O'Reilly finishes, time permitting, we'll have a few more questions and from the audience as well. So, Commissioner O'Reilly. Does anyone have, why don't you throw me another? Okay, well, I'm going to be sitting there in a moment. So I'll sit there.
You said we all had to sit.
Yeah, no, but I'm gonna sit where the water is. So I'm gonna do this really brief, Commissioner, introduction of Michael O'Reilly, because I've done it so many times before, and it's hard to keep finding new superlatives. But you all know that he's a commissioner at the FCC, was first sworn in 2013, now serving his second term, has had a long history in the Senate in serving in increasingly important, responsible positions. And, I guess I'll just say this, because over time, when I think about Commissioner O'Reilly and a characteristic that comes to mind that's important for me really is and the way he approaches his job is really his devotion to first looking at the text of the statute, looking at the Communications Act to try and figure out what it says. An originalist, I would say, in that sense. And, I think we've seen others that I would just say are not so much textualists, and that's a trait that I appreciate with Commissioner O'Reilly. So without any further ado, thank you again for coming here. I never had any doubts at all that you would make it, and we're glad to have you.
Well, thank you so very much. Randy, I know you had never any doubts except for finding someone to fill in my spot. I was previously occupied in the House Commerce Committee. They send their love to everybody. We concluded, and I was able to drive down here in a timely but safe manner. And so I'm happy to be here. I apologize if my comments are a little out of time, given the sense that they were supposed to predate the panel, so hopefully they don't regurgitate a lot of things that have already been said. And I apologize profusely for the sense that Randy asked me to be the keynote, and they're longer than you probably would like. So hopefully lunch is just sitting there and you're thinking about something else. But I'll do my best to power through these and answer any questions you may have after that. So today's topic, next generation 5G wireless networks, seizing the opportunities and overcoming the obstacles, is of great importance. The use of wireless devices has proliferated faster than most experts ever imagined. Year to year, Americans use more data, connect more devices, and have greater expectations for the services provided over wireless networks. Forecasts demonstrate that consumer demand will only increase, and this is even before you consider the Internet of Things connections. The vision for next generation or 5G networks is that they'll be able to meet the demands of a broad range of applications. While there is no firm definition, everyone agrees the next generation networks will provide greater capacity, faster speeds, and lower latency. If expectations materialize into reality, we could have the first truly terrestrial, high-speed, high-capacity, fully seamless wireless internet experience that includes wireless backhaul. Consider that I could be soon traveling on the way to a restaurant, and a 5G network will not only drive the car, but allow me to download or live stream an advanced color 8K UHD episode of Bubble Guppies on a tablet to entertain my daughter while trying to enjoy a night out with my wife. At the same time, the network may help me identify where my kids' missing shoes are. And that would be greatly appreciated because, based on experience, they could be practically anywhere on the planet. It is expected that 5G will fundamentally change the way people use the internet and even change business culture, and everything will be mobile. For example, 5G will allow virtual reality apps permitting immersive travel. You can visit Rome from your couch. A surgeon in New York will be able to operate in Alaska. Industrial manufacturing and production could be controlled wirelessly in real time. And I have seen mentions of hologram video conferencing. It is expected that such innovations will result in economic benefits to the tune of $500 billion in gross domestic product growth and more than 3 million jobs in the US alone. Globally, it is expected that 5G will generate $12.3 trillion in economic output, 22 million jobs, and the total GDP contribution between 2020 and 2035 will be equivalent to the economy of the size of India. And the race is on. Countries across the globe are vying to shape the next generation of mobile technologies and grab their slice of economic pie. There is no time to sit on the sidelines when everyone, including the standards bodies, have expedited their work to enable deployments as early as 2019. So how do we seize the opportunity that future wireless technology provide and remain global leaders in wireless while overcoming what many obstacles or challenges lie in the way? Well, the availability of spectrum is not an obstacle per se. Unencumbered spectrum for 5G is just not laying around. 5G has come to mean millimeter wave, but like many, I look at next generation networks as maximizing capabilities of both current and future networks of using low, mid, and high band spectrum, including millimeter wave band frequencies. Case in point, T-Mobile has announced that they will roll out 5G in the 600 megahertz band. Additionally, I foresee 5G taking advantage of both licensed and unlicensed operations. And every band mentioned for 5G has been previously allocated for other uses. And this itself presents a challenge. So get that second cup of coffee going and put your feet up as I'm about to power through a litany of 5G-related spectrum issues currently under review by the Commission. The latest spectrum buzz is focused on mid-bands, those between 1 and 6 gigahertz or 1 and 24 gigahertz, depending on your perspective, where there's an attractive balance between capacity and propagation. These bands carry more data than low bands, but communications travel farther than millimeter wave. This has advantages in a country of our size and geographic diversity. Not to mention, these are the very bands that the global wireless community is now targeting for 5G. For this reason, I have focused some of my attention on the 3.5 gigahertz band and was pleased to accept the chairman's offer to review our rules and ensure they maximize innovation, investment, and efficient use of the frequencies. I have met with many interested parties about the ideas. Well, a few said make no changes. The majority agreed that the PALs could use some serious improvements, with one provider seeking to license the entire band. Most everyone seems to have expressed their thoughts through one means or another, and the petitions, letters, and ex partes reflecting these views have been filed and are currently out for comment. Well, the ultimate decision of this proceeding will be based on the record, and I will read the comments as part of the deliberative process. I would like to highlight a few issues that became apparent in my conversations with stakeholders. Although many entities are willing to explore unlicensed style GAA use, more extensive 5G build-outs may require greater certainty that investment would be stranded. To provide such an environment, most stakeholders requested longer license terms, larger geographic areas, and renewability. As I've said before, I am not predisposed to disrupt the three-tier structure. I just want all three tiers to actually work. Frankly, the use of the spectrum access systems and environmental sensing capabilities, or ESC, to facilitate sharing is an experiment in and of itself. On that note, I understand that there's still significant work to be done on the ESC. It is my understanding that the Department of Defense and FCC are working on an interim step to enable some significant deployments prior to completion of the ESC. Although this is a start, the ESC must be completed with no further delays to permit full utilization of this band while protecting U.S. Navy radar systems. Meanwhile, it sounds like work on the SAS is progressing, with system tests expected to start around the January timeframe. This should match up nicely with our overall timeline to improve the licensed portion. Hopefully, the Commission will vote on a notice of proposed rulemaking in the fall and then order as soon as the new year arrives or soon after. The Commission is also seeking to expand 5G and other mid-band frequencies. The recently posted mid-band spectrum notice of inquiry, which will be voted on at the next meeting, is a great opportunity for interested parties to point out any bands between 3.7 and 24 gigahertz that can be used for wireless broadband. But make no mistake, the impetus of the NOI is clearly the 3.7 to 4.2 and 6 gigahertz bands, which are close proximity to the 3.5 gigahertz PALs. Specifically, an ad hoc coalition of equipment manufacturers, wireless providers, and unlicensed users have some ideas on how to open up this band for licensed mobile services while protecting and accommodating incumbents. This seems exceptionally doable since the C-band is mostly used to transmit video programming such as AP news programming and broadcasting cable network feeds from one point to another, and terrestrial point-to-point use is minimal. Additionally, the coalition, the coalition proposes that the 6 gigahertz band would be available for unlicensed use. This is prime spectrum for unlicensed community because there is an adjacent to 5 gigahertz, which is one of the workhorses of unlicensed. Combining these bands will allow for wider bandwidths and gigabit speeds. The coalition has stated that they will protect other users in the band, including the many and current and future terrestrial point-to-point systems. The unlicensed spectrum position will be further improved if unlicensed use is permitted in the 5.9 gigahertz band while protecting automobile, dedicated short-range communications safety systems from harmful interference. It is finally time to bring this proceeding to an end and make the determination of whether sharing is possible without causing harmful interference with the DSRC. The Commission has run tests on 9 prototypes and is currently analyzing, excuse me, that's one of the benefits of having a new toddler. You get a cold every 2 or 3 weeks. And currently analyzing the results. These devices were designed to detect DSRC signals and then vacate the band or share the spectrum with non-safety applications. It's my understanding that the device platforms are claimed in our lab tests, but stay tuned for further reports and next steps from the Commission on that. In the meantime, we must determine exactly what safety functions are planned for this band. As I've said before, dedicated DSRC spectrum should only be used to provide safety functionality, if any services at all. It can be offered by only those technologies used today or those in the planning stage as we generally move to more autonomous cars. In fact, at this month's meeting, at last month's meeting, we considered vehicular radars, which boast of providing many of the same safety benefits as DSRC. If other bands can be used to provide similar safety standards and functions that could free up the opportunity for unlicensed use, and if there's sufficient overlap, we may need to reconsider the DSRC overall. Combining the 5.9 and 6 gigahertz band is the best option to expand current unlicensed operations and promote continued growth, especially since efforts to open additional frequencies in the 5 gigahertz band, known as the Uni-2B, were unsuccessful. Turning to millimeter wave. Meanwhile, the Commission's spectrum efforts have progressed the furthest in the millimeter wave bands, which will provide both unlicensed and licensed spectrum. A year ago this month, the Commission released its hallmark order opening these high-frequency bands for commercial wireless uses. Our action put the U.S. in a leadership position when it comes to allocating high-band spectrum. Well, this was the first step. There are petitions for reconsideration and issues raised in the further notice, including proposals about further sharing mechanisms that need to be resolved to provide industry the needed certainty. Hopefully, the Commission will take action on this in the fall so that industry has full knowledge of the rules in the 28, 39, 37, 39, and 64 to 71 gigahertz bands. Further, the Commission must act on licensed bands as soon as possible, but at a minimum, we should schedule the action and auction so its interested parties can plan accordingly. But we can't rest on our laurels. Additional spectrum is needed now, and we need to identify the bands for the future. This is why I insisted a year ago for future bands to be identified and added to the further notice. In fact, I would have preferred a more holistic spectrum review so that we could determine which bands are not efficiently being used as possible and which cannot support other uses. But we did move the ball by identifying 6 additional bands. I would like the Commission to move on all, but I recognize that some may present future issues and may be considered sooner rather than later. As we identify other future bans, incumbency issues become more difficult to resolve. Basically, all of the low-hanging fruit has already been picked. There are bans, however, that are greater interest to manufacturers and providers that should make the greatest effort to move those ahead of the line. When talking to industry, it is easy to identify a trend. There is great interest in the 24 and 42 gigahertz bands as they are near the 28 and 37 to 39 gigahertz bands that we've already opened. Devices can be manufactured to operate over tuning ranges. So 24 and 28 gigahertz could be able to accommodate in the same chip, and 37, 39, and 42 gigahertz provide the same opportunity. This is especially important for frequencies surrounding 28 gigahertz, which many countries are unwilling to consider for 5G. Using tuning ranges, devices can operate on 28 gigahertz in the US, but also on 24 or 26 gigahertz in other nearby bands, while in other countries, creating de facto global harmonization. While the US has moved forward in some cases without global allocations, harmonization is beneficial for many reasons. For instance, it promotes innovation, investment, and research and development, and resulting devices are cheaper to produce because of the greater economies of scale when new technologies can be marketed globally. Additionally, it allows consumers to use the same devices and functionalities both at home and abroad. It's why events at the World Radio Communications Conference 2015, where certain countries refused to permit simple studies of mobile use in the 28 gigahertz, were so disappointing. Studies should never be blocked, as they are the means to determine whether a band can support additional uses. There were also egregious decisions made when it came to discussion of a mobile allocation at 600 megahertz. For the first time ever, a country could only support the allocation if its neighbors approved. This basically created a veto power for certain nations that certainly wasn't even announced until everyone was already in attendance at WRC. Ironically enough, some countries are now regretting their decisions, as forward-looking nations like the US have rushed ahead, leaving them in the proverbial dust. This instance helps demonstrate that the ITU needs an overhaul. Clearly, greater transparency and process reform are needed. People once doubted the FCC could improve its internal working procedures, but we did, and have more fixes in the pipeline, so anything is possible. Further, the ITU is being used by authoritative governments to push their myopic agendas. Controls need to be put in place to ensure that the ITU remains focused on its core mission as opposed to engaging in mission creep, such as the activities to regulate the internet to placate certain governments. Failure to reform are likely to lead to calls for the U.S. to defund the ITU. I can't say that I don't understand their frustration, but it may be premature to take this step. If we are at least going to be part of this organization, we have the chance to fight back and win the hearts and minds of the world community. If the U.S. does remain involved, I suggest that we need to play a bigger role in the ITU leadership. It is ironic that we are the second largest contributor of funds to the ITU, but only one Secretary General has come from the U.S. in 150 years, and the last American sector head was approximately 25 years ago. Unfortunately, efforts to manipulate international processes seem to be spreading. Traditionally, standards bodies have been the domain of industry engineers and tech geeks. However, lately, there's been a concerted effort by some countries to manipulate these multi-stakeholder bodies. I've heard several reports of some authoritative governments are now focusing their attention on leadership position at these organizations so they can promote their agendas and dictate the future designs of not only wireless networks, but also the internet. This disturbing trend cannot be allowed to succeed. We will rue the day that long-standing standards body processes were allowed to become tainted and their outcomes to become similarly suspect. In my opinion, turning topic to the issue of infrastructure, the biggest obstacle standing in front of 5G networks is infrastructure deployment. To realize its potential, 5G will require densified networks of millions of small cells. This will clearly be a timely and capital-intensive undertaking. Complicating matters are some state, local, and tribal governments that are placing barriers in front of infrastructure, including treating these antennas, which are smaller than pizza boxes and will be placed on buildings, utility poles, and streetlights every few blocks or so, like they're macro towers. Of course, I recognize that not all are bad actors, but in this case, the bad actors ruin it for everyone. Despite previous efforts by the Commission and Congress to curb this behavior, problems are still substantial. For example, providers seeking permitting approval are still experiencing excessive delays and even flat-out moratoria. One provider reports that 75 jurisdictions have taken more than a year to come to an agreement to use rights-of-way. 11 have taken more than 18 months, and 2 have taken more than 2 years. Verizon has reported that at least 34 communities have either explicit moratoria or just refuse to process applications or engage with applicants. This is blatantly illegal. Providers' applications are also being rejected for inappropriate reasons, such as radio frequency exposure considerations and aesthetics. Some localities have denied new or additional facilities if they don't agree with the proposed type of the placement of equipment, or because a provider already has coverage in an area, therefore prohibiting quality of service upgrades. Some even go as far as saying that the infrastructure should be located underground, which makes a heck of a lot of sense for those wireless services, doesn't it? We must accept the fate that localities should not be making such decisions, and in fact, they are expressly prohibited under law from basing decisions on RF exposure. Finally, providers are paying astronomical fees comparable to those paid for macro towers for small cell approvals. It is estimated that wireless operators will invest $275 billion to build out 5G in the next 7 years. But I fear this may be difficult to stay within the bounds of this lofty number if state, local, and tribal governments continue to exploit small cells to raise revenue. However, the Commission appears primed to act and concurrently has 3 open proceedings on infrastructure. The chairman has also instituted the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee to look into some of these same issues. Finally, to truly benefit from 5G, consumers will need mobile devices and handsets to connect these new networks. Commission staff is working to provide guidance on how this will evaluate radio frequency emissions for millimeter wave requirements. Current Commission rules pertaining to 6 gigahertz equipment are based on industry standards that specify limits for whole body exposure, which is used for infrastructure deployments, but not for localized exposure, which is used for mobile handsets and other devices. Simply put, we must interpret how to reasonably tailor existing emission limits designed for base stations to handsets. Without this guidance, there may be a manufacturing delay and reduced investment. Therefore, the Commission must provide the guidance it promised in the Spectrum Frontiers order, and hopefully, standard-setting bodies will also consider these issues expeditiously. On a side note, back in 2013, the Commission opened a proceeding on RF standards to tee up whether any changes needed to be made to our rules. But this predates 5G. Some localities appear to have impeded deployments of small cells and potentially 5G because they are concerned with the health risks. I want to be clear, this doesn't mean that we are putting people at risk from RF exposure. We have standards and rules in place for RF exposure that apply to all infrastructure, including small cells and 5G. If no general changes need to be made, the Commission should acknowledge this and close the docket. So if there's anyone still out there awake, those are my views on enormous potential of 5G networks to change the commercial marketplace and the individual consumer's wireless experience. It also expresses my views on a myriad of issues facing its deployment and development. I certainly thank you so much for your attention, and I apologize for being late, although I do believe I have a good reason. Thank you very much.
Commissioner O'Reilly, I just want to say that was really terrific. You know, when I found out that there was going to be that hearing and that it might conflict with you even being here, you know, at best, I thought if you did arrive that we might get some perfunctory remarks or whatever. I should have known you much better. But what I really want to say, and boy, I wish I can't write the stories for the press, but if I could, I would say the fact that you had that oversight hearing today, and I know you had to prepare for that, and then the fact that you prepared such a detailed, important address for us today really means a lot, and it's very important, and we thank you for that.
You're very kind.
Would you be able to take a couple questions? Are you
Sure.
able to do that?
Sure.
Okay, I'm gonna call on someone. Wait until you're recognized. Okay, I just spoke of the press, right? Did you hear what I said? Okay. Okay, I want to call on Paul Kirby first.
Paul Kirby with TR Daily. You mentioned the 3.5 gigahertz band. Have you given your whatever recommendations you have to the chairman after your meetings with various stakeholders on changes to the band?
We are communicating with the chairman's office and hopefully be able to move soon forward on the topic. I don't want to get too into to our inner workings of the commission, but I think we're progressing nicely.
Okay, Howard?
Yeah, I want to echo, that was a big speech for a day when you had it, and so I know you're working your staff pretty hard.
I was going to say, in fairness, I have wonderful staff.
So we've been writing a little bit about with the wireless infrastructure, how a big question is, industry really wants deemed granted, and that, and Randy had touched on the fact that you're a strict constructionist, so it sort of ties back to that. What's sort of the latest thinking on the FCC's authority in an area like that, and what are your concerns?
Well, I had said when the item went out that was something I wanted to see what the record had for it going forward. So I don't want to suggest that I was closing the door to that activity. I was just saying, having been there, lived through some of those provisions being adopted, living through a number of the court cases since then, I wanted to see what the record was and what submissions have had. And we're just still digesting that and just seeing what, where the chairman wants to go on that particular piece. But there's a lot of good ideas in those items, both the PN and the NPRM, to go forward and take active. I'm a firm believer that we're going to need to exercise our preemptive authority to the to the fullest extent that Congress has provided. I was just before the committee, and they asked what we could do. I suggested, quite honestly, that if they were of the mindset that they could provide us additional authority or clarify existing provisions, that would be helpful along these lines. Because, as the panel, what I got to see of the panel, what I heard certainly was that there are definitely good actors in this space, and the commission knows that, but there are a number of bad actors, and I talked about them in my speech, that are causing the problems, that are causing delay, that are causing extensive costs to be imposed on carriers, which gets passed on to consumers, and delaying broadband deployment. So that's problematic from my perspective and unacceptable from Congress, given that they've given us this authority in the past.
Okay, Mike, in my welcome this morning, I initially said that if you thought you were in a net neutrality program, again, you've stumbled into the wrong place, and that we might get, at least 2/3 of the way into the program before we mention net neutrality, and I even bet my house on that. Well, now we're 2/3 of the way into the program, so I just want to ask you this question because it hadn't been mentioned, and I understand you're just as you said, you're reading the comments. You don't know what you'll do, and I understand that. But nevertheless, you mentioned investment earlier, and others did. Can you just say anything at all about whether there's a relationship in your mind between the net neutrality proceeding, the Restoring Internet Freedom proceeding, and the future of 5G deployment?
So, like you indicated, we do have a proceeding before us. There's a long-standing dispute over the investment data points that some people have, and we had a little bit of that interaction in House Commerce today regarding some of the data points. But look, for those that are willing to put capital at risk and their company's future on spectrum bands that are in 28 or 37 or 39 in the licensed space, or 64 to 71 and unlicensed, that are willing to do so and risk their future. I think added burdens that are imposed by the commission under the net neutrality regime cause more uncertainty and the willingness not to do so. And so I have problems in the past about my views on net neutrality are well known. I've said to people and said publicly that I am open to the comments in the record changing my opinion. We'll just see if they do, and we'll just see how the summer plays out. So we'll see. But I think that there are definitely instances of what you can't necessarily show is the counterfactuals. What would have happened had these rules not been in place? That's the impossible to know. People can tell you what they might have done, but it's different than the rules are actually in place at the time. And yeah, there was a comment by former Chairman Wheeler at an event recently I read where he thought that the greatest component of net neutrality, the greatest piece that he adopted was the general conduct standard. The bright line rules were, I'm sure, fabulous in his mind, but the general conduct standard was the heart and the gold of his item. But to me, that is the absolute backwards of the commission's goals, right? To have this provision that can just to be utilized by a bureau and just rove around and do whatever it wants at any time without any requirements from the commission. We saw that play out in the scenario in zero rating. 10 months later, we had no action from the commission. The day after election, surprisingly, we had a little bit of a dust up over some letters. So look, we'll see where the item goes later this summer, and we'll just we'll go from there.
Okay, well, here's what I want to do. We're going to excuse Commissioner O'Reilly, and in just a moment we're going to give him another big round of applause. But I don't want anyone else to leave right then, because I'm going to ask you to say, after he leaves, our panel is here, and we rearranged things, but I want to do a few more questions for our panel, and then we'll wrap up. Let's please give Commissioner O'Reilly a big round of applause. Okay, now I'm taking names, so just sit there for a minute, because we want to just go for just about another 5 minutes, because I want the panel to have a chance to answer some questions. I have a couple, but does anyone have a question for the panel? Back, well, Kathy, take that mic back there. And then we'll have time for one or two more if someone else has one. And direct it to a specific member of the panel if you could.
Hi, my name is Deborah Lathan, and this question is directed to Mr. Weninger. I'm sorry. I apologize for mispronouncing your name. First of all, I just commend you. I think it's amazing that you were able to pull off in Arizona what you pulled off getting this bill done. My question is, what was the time frame? How long did it take you to do it, to actually make this happen? And the other question is, does the bill require deployment in all areas, such as the rural parts of Arizona as well?
Thank you for the question. I'll kind of start backwards. I know that's a big issue. Nationwide is getting the rural deployment, and that came up a lot in the Senate hearing that I was in. But no, it didn't require any of that. The process was very long. They approached me about running the bill in November or December. Our session starts in January. When they came to me, they were like, "This is going to be a big deal," and I was like, "Yeah, okay." I didn't anticipate it was going to be as robust of a process of what it was, but we started right off the bat in January, and I mean, it's a little deceiving that I think I was looking at the vote count. At the ending vote, we had one person out of 90 who voted against it on the final read. But that is quite deceiving because, I mean, up until a few days before, we didn't know if we were getting everything in. So we just kind of, there was trust built between us and mainly the League of Cities. I had worked with one of the intergovs with the League of Cities in Chandler. There was some trust there. There was trust with other stakeholders. And so when we got some of these items out of the way, we kept the process moving. It took clear till May, but we kept the process moving. So we passed it out of committee knowing that we would have a whole lot of amendments on the floor of the House. We passed it out of the House knowing that we were going to need amendments in the Senate, and it was going to come back to the House. But there was that trust built with everyone involved, and so it worked out. But it did not get done till the right at the end of session in May.
Jeff, I want to make sure we just get a couple more. And I wanted to ask Jonathan, because I was thinking of asking the question before the last one, because you come out of a rural state, South Dakota, and more to the point, you served as rural utilities, blah, 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 administrator. So I think this question of how 5G affects rural areas or may not be helpful in getting them served is an important one, because the commission, of course, now is focusing quite pointedly on trying to get broadband to rural areas. So I thought you might also address that question.
Well, you know, that's a tricky one because I like to be real straightforward. And the fact is that, bluntly speaking, 4G is the last to get to rural, and 5G is probably the last to get to rural, too. We talked about $275 billion in investment, and there's not enough capital to go around. And so what you generally see is that the infrastructure first goes towards where the most dense population is. It's just basic economics. And so without some type of assistance in one way or another, rural tends to be last. And when it comes to reg relief as well, it's the same thing. The regulatory barriers tend to be lower in rural areas because they're desperate for the infrastructure, and they'll roll out the red carpet. So reg relief doesn't tend to provide the same type of assistance that it would in a more urbanized area. So the news is not, you know, all rosy for rural America. I mean, if they could get 5G, the benefits would be probably outsized because of their need for it. But it's probably going to take a while. And I think the more that you throw up barriers in urban and suburban areas, the longer it's going to take, because that limited capital will never make it out to rural if people are tied up in urban areas. So the government doing what they did in Arizona and making it easier to get to Phoenix will make it easier to get to Yuma. You know, I mean, by the time you have to go through hell in Phoenix, you're not going to have any capital left over to get to the more rural areas. So I think the kind of steps that Arizona State Guarantee that we heard from Commissioner O'Reilly, or that Congress is involved in, are all going to help rural, but none of them are a silver bullet because there's a basic economics issue. But in order to reduce the drag, if you will, is important in order to allow these companies to get to where they need to go in rural America.
Do we have another question from the audience? Okay, well then I'll ask the last question, then we'll wrap up. But I'm going to ask Robert this. You know, now that I'm safe in broaching net neutrality, you know, towards the end, and I appreciated what Commissioner O'Reilly said, but you're not even writing have to write the commission's order. I mean, from Verizon's perspectives, or the industry's more broadly, if you care to speak for the industry, how do you see the net neutrality proceeding, and you know, the effort to change, eliminate Title II? How does that play into this 5G debate and 5G's future from your own perspective?
So, you know, I'd say on that front that, you know, Verizon for the last number of years has been, you know, squarely where I think Chairman Thune is, which is, you know, we're very supportive of what, you know, Chairman Pai is doing today, but we also are very supportive of, you know, a process where Congress is ultimately writing the rules of the road. You know, and as, you know, taking off my Verizon hat and being a former, you know, Senate staffer, you know, this issue has been punted around now for more years than I care to count, which originally started, you know, back in the day, we were calling it open access. And I think that, you know, clearly the statute needs to be updated, you know, and I'd argue that the entire statute needs to be updated, but it's particularly in this particular issue, you know, Chairman Thune and many others have been talking for years now and working with Ranking Member Nelson to try to find a solution which works for everybody. And I think, you know, I do take maybe some heartening if you review some of the statements from some of those who have previously been opposed, that I think the door, you know, hopefully is opening to Congress being involved. I didn't get to listen to the hearing today, obviously, that was going on the House side, but I think I'm encouraged, and hopefully I think from a Verizon perspective, we're encouraged about a legislative process, and we hope that, you know, that will, you know, take root and be able to get calmer heads to prevail and be able to sit down at the table and really look at this issue and try to find ways to actually put it into law and put it into the statute, which ultimately I think would be the best solution.
Yeah, echoing all of what Robert just said, you know, Chairman Thune continues to stand willing to talk to Democrats and anyone else that wants to come to the table to talk about a permanent legislative solution on net neutrality. He continues to say that. We saw some good developments actually come out of the Internet Day of Protest. We saw a lot of the bigger companies actually come out and say that a legislative solution might be the way to go here. So we're moving closer. We hope to get closer. But, you know, Chairman Thune continues to stand willing to talk about a net neutrality solution.
Jeff, I'm going to let you stay out of the net neutrality debate for the moment. Okay, well, the first thing I want to do is just thank again the Arizona PBS for being here. We appreciate it, and this is an issue that's important to Arizona and all of the other states, so thank you. And I want to thank, of course, our panelists. I thought those were really excellent presentations. We appreciate it. It's only a small token of appreciation, but please take with you the Free State Foundation caps. Crystal, I don't know what the rules are up there, but that, you know, my wife can vouch for the fact that cap cost about $9. If you can take it, and please do. And now, if all of you will join me in thanking this panel, I'd appreciate it.